I'm very happy to be here, and I'm happy that everyone here is able to join us. I'll dive right into the talk. The title of my talk is a little bit misleading. Holding a grudge against someone or something typically entails harboring persistent resentment towards that person or thing, which resulted from past insult or injury. And according to this definition, I have no grudges against nudges. After all, I do not resent nudging, nor do I claim to have suffered any past injustice from this behavioral intervention. Instead, when I state that I hold grudges against nudges, I simply wish to flag the unfriendly feelings that I have towards the overall nudge literature as someone who has contributed to the normative foundations of behavioral welfare economics and for the ethical permissibility of green nudging. Thus, while some might have read the title of this essay and gleefully predicted a polemical diatribe against nudging, my talk, it might disappoint you. After all, it is neither for or against nudging in toto as a domain of research or an approach to public policymaking. If anything, my talk today can be viewed as a call for a more humble and sober approach to questions about the efficacy and the ethical permissibility of nudging, one that is based on the best evidence and arguments available. While some scholars have come out swinging either for or against nudging, my own view is that when it comes to nudging, especially the ethical permissibility of nudging, green nudging, pro-social nudging, it's a nuanced affair, one that ought to be considered on a case-by-case basis. The enormous interdisciplinary literature that covers the ethics of nudging, it would be more fruitful, I think, if calmer heads prevail. Now, with this clarification behind us, I've got three grudges against nudges, or quasi-grudges. The first of which concerns the basic categories, ethical and epistemic, that philosophers of economics, economic methodologists, and political philosophers have tended to focus on in the literature. I'll refer to these categories as the core nudge research among these scholars. So many of us concerned with behavioral public policy, the concept nudge, it denotes a particular kind of intervention that raises serious questions about the efficacy and ethics of this behavioral intervention. After all, nudges typically involve an authority, like a government agency, intervening in a person's choice architecture with the intention to help them make better decisions according to that person's subjective standards. At least that's what's supposed to be the case. Given the overall aim of these nudges, I'll generally refer to them as traditional welfare nudges, which are, as defined here, any aspect of the choice architecture that alters a person's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing the economic incentives. So the prices remain the same with a nudge, for example. Many scholars have argued that such so-called libertarian interventions, they fly under the heading of the new paternalism. They're objectionably paternalistic. Okay, so that's one of the main ethical worries, is that they're paternalistic in objectionable ways. Others have argued that nudges can sometimes violate autonomy. They can be disrespectful, insulting, infantilizing. If any of you are familiar with the nudging literature, you're familiar with these objections. While this talk's not a place for a systematic literature review on the ethics of nudging, one can appreciate that the ethics of nudging literature has, over the last several years, grown into a sizable and respectable research program, one that's well known among philosophers of economics and the wider social scientific community. In addition to concerns about the ethics of nudging, the authority who aspires to nudge others is confronted with a well-known epistemic challenge. After all, even if it were ethically permissible to nudge people towards making choices that are better according to their own subjective standards, there's no consensus on what this standard is and how the public policymakers can come to know about that. This is the so-called knowledge problem that has been so central to much research on nudging, again, among philosophers of economics. Many behavioral scientists, especially behavioral economists, subscribe to the view that a typical person's latent preferences or their true preferences should serve as the standard for welfare or well-being. Unlike revealed preferences from revealed preference theory, a person's true preferences are not always revealed through choice. True preferences have been defined variously. At times, they have been defined subjunctively as the preferences that a person would have acted upon, but at other times they have been defined non-subjunctively as a person's authentic or genuine preferences that may not be revealed through choice. Either way, the main reason to focus on the satisfaction of a person's true preference rather than their revealed preferences that choices that can be distorted by a variety of factors, including psychological factors such as limited attention, inferior cognitive abilities, a lack of self-control, factors like this. When such choice situations are viewed as a person making errors or mistakes, which is often the case, then this creates an opening for an argument for something that must be done, a corrective, and that's where nudging comes in. Now, arguably, the ethics of welfare nudging and the knowledge problem associated with true preferences, they form the core research program among philosophers of economics. Now, my first grudge against nudges concerns this focus, or more specifically, the focus of the ethics of welfare nudging literature. Until now, there has been almost a univocal focus on the ethics of this traditional form of welfare nudging. And I think that where we should be going is instead towards social nudging. So in my opinion, we have bigger fish to fry. And this is my son, actually, holding a brown trout, which originates in Germany, in fact. But this is last month in Arizona on the Black River. So we've got bigger fish to fry. At present, the ethics of welfare nudging, it's an essential part of the core research of nudging, while the ethics of social nudges, pro-social nudging, is at best a secondary or part of the periphery. This situation, it should be reversed. The ethics of social nudges should form the core of the ethics of nudging among philosophers of economics, while the ethics of traditional welfarist nudging should become peripheral. In the very least, the attention given to ethics, ethics of social nudging, it should be on par with the ethics of traditional welfare nudging. But why? First, what are social nudges anyway? Michiro Negatsu, he defines them as policy interventions to induce voluntary cooperation in social dilemma situations, or nudges that aim to increase people's voluntary provision of public goods. So-called green nudges are one species of social nudge that aim to reduce or eliminate environmentally mediated harms to a third party. Among sustainability scientists and scholars, climate nudges are probably the most important form of green nudges, which have been defined as any intentional modification of the true architecture that aims to alter citizen behavior towards climate-friendly actions while maintaining their earlier alternatives. And that definition is by Stipi and Koi, some Finnish scholars. So hopefully not too much is needed to motivate the claim that anthropogenic climate change is an urgent environmental problem, at least not for this audience, especially for the world's most vulnerable populations, who may not have the resources to help mitigate the problem or adapt to climate impacts. Climate change is among the most significant negative externalities confronting humanity today, even if there might be rampant disagreement about what should be done to address it and who should bear the costs to mitigate the harmful impacts associated with climate change. Most of us in this room are familiar with the IPCC's most recent assessment report. Their high emissions socioeconomic pathway, it includes a +4 degrees warming in their very likely range, 66 to 100% range by 2100. And many experts believe that this level of warming, it could lead to climate collapse or civilization collapse caused by climate change. So few would deny that climate change is an urgent problem that warrants the attention of just about everyone, including philosophers, public policymakers, economists, and behavioral scientists. But unfortunately, at present, the ethics of social nudges, like climate nudges, they consist of only a very small and fragmented literature in the ethics of climate change. Now, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this small literature, which focuses on the ethics of climate nudging, is the near universal consensus on the ethical permissibility of these social nudges. Take, for example, green nudging. Unlike ordinary nudges, which are interventions designed to make nudgees better off by their own subjective standards, green nudges, they generally aim to promote environmentally friendly behavior. While those intervened upon by green nudges, these green nudges, they can make nudgees, they can make them worse off, better off, or equally well off. That's not the main intention of doing a green nudge. the main intention of pursuing that kind of policy intervention is to eliminate or blunt a negative externality. While there are classic ethical problems associated with ordinary nudging, such as paternalism and violations of individual autonomy, these problems tend to gain much less traction against green nudging specifically and social nudging in general. Why? On most philosophical accounts of paternalism, a person or agent aims to benefit another agent, but this general structure, it's absent in the case of green nudging, which aims to address a social problem or inefficiency, and not necessarily to benefit the one who's actually being nudged. Moreover, every classic liberal knows there's a significant ethical difference between merely intervening paternalistically to make nudgees better off and intervening to help prevent one party from harming another party. In other words, green nudges will almost certainly be more easily justifiable than ordinary nudges, other things being equal. Be that as it may, it does not entail that green nudging, including behavioral interventions to address climate change, should be given a carte blanche. Far from it. More research is needed on the ethics of social nudging, green nudging, and climate nudging, not only because such interventions aim to address socially urgent problems, including climate change, but because there are many interesting and distinct questions that are to be answered, such as the ethical permissibility of green nudging compared to the ethical permissibility of welfare nudging. Consider an example. Suppose X hypothesize that we have a moral obligation to address climate change, seems like a pretty reasonable assumption, and that nudging to mitigate the harmful impacts of climate change was determined to be effective and cheap compared to the alternative policy instruments. In this case, the ethics of nudging may not merely concern questions about their permissibility, but about whether we have a moral obligation to engage in green nudging. After all, if nudging is the cheapest and most efficient policy alternative for a particular social problem, by hypothesis, then policymakers who are working on that problem, it seems like we might even have a moral obligation to nudge, which is something of a fascinating thing, given that most of the ethics of nudging literature has focused on the problems, and yet we might actually have a duty to nudge if nudging is the cheapest and most effective way to address negative externalities. But to be clear, I'm not arguing that we have a moral obligation to nudge here. Instead, I'm only raising the issue as a distinct possibility. I'm pointing to a gap in the literature. I'm emphasizing this issue, whether some agents have a moral obligation to nudge. It's a distinctive question to social nudging, and it should be addressed by scholars who focus on the ethics of nudging specifically. Another distinctive ethical issue that arises with social nudging, especially when such interventions are designed to address a socially urgent problem, is that given the gravity of the problem at hand, there may be pressure to intervene with social nudging at all costs. When it comes to social nudging in the context of urgent circumstances, there's a special risk of alarmism, which could entail reaching false conclusions about the ethical permissibility of social nudging. The very language of urgency and emergency to take measures now, including social nudging, to address climate change, for example, it may generate a special risk when reaching false conclusions. What's needed instead are conclusions about the ethics and efficacy of social nudging that are even-handed or evidence-based. In any case, my modest claim here is that such issues simply do not arise when it comes to the ethics of traditional welfare nudging. The ethics of social nudging, it presents us with a special case. The ethics of social nudging, it should no longer be located, I don't think, along the periphery, but it should be something that's central to the literature that most scholars are interested in. So to argue that the ethics of social nudging, it should be a core component of the wider literature on the ethics of nudging, it's not to suggest that if social nudging were to be given more attention by ethicists, that it would magically solve all of our social problems. Social nudging is, of course, one tool in the toolkit of behavior change. When negative externalities are present, there are many other tools like Coasian bargaining, market-based approaches such as pollution or cap and trade programs, Pigovian taxes, or conventional regulatory approaches. I make no claim about the comparative efficacy of such policy interventions. That's an empirical question, and this is more of a philosophical piece. I simply wish to emphasize that there's no good reason to exclude social nudging as a potential public policy intervention a priori, as some are wont to do. The efficacy of social nudging, including green nudging, in any given context is always going to be an empirical question. While no one should believe that we'll be nudging our way out of a complex collective action problem, such as climate change, neither should anyone believe without evidence that those behavioral interventions, including social nudgings, are completely ineffectual or ethically impermissible. That would be my worry from those who are really concerned with, nudging violating individual autonomy, for example. In fact, recent evidence that behavioral interventions with social comparisons to address climate change, they can be very powerful, even more powerful than financial incentives. There was a recent article that was published in the PNAS, for example. So when it comes to a socially relevant topic, such as the ethics of nudging, urgency matters when it comes to decisions about prioritizing research. Of course, that's not to suggest that urgent matters should get no attention, only that the traditional core that constitutes the ethics of nudging research, it should be balanced with behavioral interventions designed to blunt socially urgent problems, including climate nudges. Scholars writing on the ethical permissibility of nudging, they have a moral reason to focus their attention on the ethical permissibility of interventions that are designed to address the most socially urgent problems of our times. And there's nothing wrong with doing ethics of nudging for its own sake. I don't mean to say that we should not be doing the traditional ethics of nudging that so many scholars are involved with. That's still on the table. Again, it should just be part of the periphery and not part of the core if we take the argument from urgency seriously. Okay. So we'll move on to my second grudge against nudge. My second grudge against nudge concerns the traditional division in the nudge literature between the ethics and the efficacy of nudging. Arguably, most scientists and scholars, they would likely agree that there's a neat and tidy division of labor between philosophers on the one hand and behavioral scientists on the other. Political philosophers and philosophers of economics, they've tended to focus on the ethics of nudging, while behavioral scientists have tended to focus on their attention on the efficacy of nudging, including how these interventions interact with other kinds of policy interventions, and especially Pigovian taxes. These two subfields of nudge research, they're often treated as separate and distinct, hermetically sealed off from one another, with the first apparently containing value-free descriptive content, right, about the efficacy of nudging. It's purely a question of science, how efficacious are these interventions, and the other only containing a question about values, whether or not these interventions are ethically permissible. I think this division, it rests on a mistake. To make my case for this claim, I'll consider how, in some cases, drawing conclusions about the efficacy of nudging requires making value judgments. Specifically, there are cases when reaching conclusions about the efficacy of nudging involves taking inductive risks, and managing such risks involves ethical value judgments. Moreover, I'll argue that the very concept of nudge is no longer purely descriptive, if it ever was. I'm not sure if I'll get to that argument, but I'll try. I might not have enough time to get to that second one. Instead, nudge, it's become what philosophers call a fit concept, one that contains both descriptive and evaluative components. Think of the word like taxation for Americans, right? It's like, it's not merely descriptive, it's like a bad thing. The very concept is like a negative thing. Whereas taxation in Canada, where I was born, it's like, well, you're going to tax me, but what am I going to get out of it? That's the question. It's not necessarily bad. I'm not sure how the word taxation lands in Germany, but that's how it lands in America and in Canada. So my point here, though, is that nudge has become a kind of lightning rod for disagreement between scholars who are cautiously optimistic about bringing some goodness to the world and those who have come to view the very concept as denoting interventions that are like malicious or bad, full stop. So this inductive risk, I'll now move on to this inductive risk business here. So inductive risk, it can be a relevant factor when reaching conclusions about the efficacy of nudging, And when this is the case, there's no way for behavioral scientists to avoid values, including ethical values. Inductive risk, it refers to the risks and consequences associated with accepting an incorrect and unjustified inductive inference in a scientific context, which is an issue that has led contemporary philosophers of science to accept the claim that good science not only depends upon shared epistemic values like consistency, scope, fruitfulness, generality, values that are essential to the very scientific enterprise itself, but non-epistemic values as well, like social, ethical, and political values. Inductive risk is particularly relevant for scientists, including behavioral scientists, when decisions about their findings lead to significant social consequences. Take, for example, the scientific methods used to determine whether a new experimental drug is safe based on evidence generated by a randomized control trial, the so-called gold standard of randomized experiments. Deciding whether the drug is safe necessarily involves inductive reasoning, and this reasoning involves risks. Why? An incorrect conclusion about the safety of the drug, it could result in either harmful side effects for the public if the drug is unsafe, or a missed opportunity to benefit the public if the safe drug is deemed unsafe. And so there's an inductive risk that enters into the very science itself when it comes to trying to accept a hypothesis within the context of science itself. Because there's always some risk of error in inductive reasoning, scientists must consider not just the evidence, but also the potential, all things considered, consequences of their conclusions being incorrect. Okay. Inductive risk intertwines scientific inquiry and testing with non-epistemic values, including ethical values, because the acceptability of risk in some cases will depend on them. But it'll depend on them, potential outcomes, and the people affected by them. Inductive risk, it entails that the best scientific practices are not always value-free. So we're no longer in this world of having a value-free ideal in science, but instead it requires engaging non-epistemic values in some way, making them explicit. At least this has been the argument by philosophers of science like Heather Douglas, I should say. Even if one accepts that inductive risk must be addressed with socially relevant scientific contexts, it might remain unclear how this is relevant to making inductions about the efficacy of nudging. After all, when it comes to nudging, the received view is that what matters, that matters of ethics and efficacy, they're separate and distinct. Yet few would deny that nudging is a socially relevant behavioral intervention. That's the whole point, right? A claim that is made plain by these pro-social nudges, as described earlier. So consider once again a particular kind of social nudge, one that's designed to mitigate GHGs, the main cause of climate change. Given the widely accepted peril associated with unchecked climate change, especially for vulnerable populations, there is some inductive risk associated with social scientific experiments concerning the efficacy of climate nudges. Why? An incorrect conclusion about the efficacy of such nudges, it could result in either harmful side effects for the public if the behavioral intervention is incorrectly deemed to be harmful in some ways, but efficacious, or if there was a missed opportunity for public benefit, helping to blunt an enormous negative externality, i.e. climate change, for which some third party is being harmed, or asked to shoulder a cost that ought to be redressed if the intervention were efficacious and ethical, but mistakenly deemed to be ethically impermissible. So the worry is that you would have some people who say these interventions are ethically impermissible, but they're wrong about that. It's just not borne out, and we missed our opportunity to adopt these super effective policy interventions. In both cases, there's a risk of error in inductive reasoning when it comes to judgments about the efficacy of climate nudging. In these cases, behavioral scientists must not merely consider the empirical evidence before them that confirms or disconfirms a hypothesis concerning the efficacy of climate nudging, but they also need to take into consideration the all things considered consequences of their actions in accepting and rejecting hypotheses within the context of the scientific enterprise in which they're working. If I'm right, then there's at least some cases of social nudging when the conclusions reached by behavioral scientists about the efficacy of such interventions involve inductive risks and therefore non-epistemic values. This conclusion, it negates the received view in the nudge literature, which, as mentioned already, it generally proceeds as if questions about efficacy and questions about values, they're separate and distinct. I think that's just wrong. There's a related point to make as well. There are some cases when the ethical permissibility of nudging will depend, at least in part, on the efficacy of nudging, which is mainly an empirical question. After all, to clinch a conclusion about the ethical permissibility of nudging can sometimes require information about the efficacy of this intervention. I'll give you an example. Suppose that a government designed a social nudge, a green nudge that was not only disrespectful towards nudgees, but it violated their autonomy. One can imagine that independent of the empirical evidence, the efficacy of this green nudging, one might be tempted to conclude that it would be impermissible. Yet a conclusion about the ethical permissibility of green nudging, it should depend in part on the consequences that it would have realized as well. So setting ordinary welfare nudging to the side for the purposes of this argument, if one considers the ethics of climate nudging specifically, then deciding on the ethical permissibility of such interventions, it'll depend in part on how effective these interventions are, especially when compared to alternative policy interventions. Other things being equal, green nudging that is particularly effective at mitigating harmful effects of climate change, they'll be easier to justify on ethical grounds than green nudging that is not only ethically problematic, but ineffective. Okay. So if my argument's sound, then there's at least some cases when reaching conclusions about the ethics and efficacy of nudging, they'll be interdependent. And I call this the interdependent thesis. This thesis, I think, is striking because scientists and scholars, they often proceed as if they were separate and distinct questions. One consequence of accepting the interdependence thesis is that the traditional categories of research on nudging are disrupted, whereas the traditional division between the ethics and efficacy of nudging appears to naturally support a division of labor between behavioral scientists and philosophers, with the former focusing on the questions of efficacy and the latter focusing on the question of ethics. The interdependence thesis, it appears to prescribe integrated, interdisciplinary research that involves ethicists and behavioral scientists working together. So in a way, it's an argument for interdisciplinarity, if we wanted yet another argument for that. Okay. On to my third and final grudge against nudges. My third grudge is that scholars and behavioral scientists, they rarely acknowledge how cross-cultural differences affect conclusions about the efficacy and ethics of nudging. And here my criticism is mainly directed at philosophers of economics who have focused on the ethics of nudging. Nudges have what some social scientists have referred to as a weird problem. The acronym WEIRD, it was originally introduced by Joe Henrich at Harvard, now at Harvard, and it stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Henrich and his co-authors, they introduced the concept to raise awareness about the problem of overgeneralizing about human beings based on data derived from a very small sample of humanity, namely those who fall under the category of weird. The main problem with respect to weird and behavioral interventions that include nudging is that the empirical basis for many behavioral insights used to justify nudging, such as biases, heuristics, and assumptions about human behavior, they're skewed towards weird people who do not represent most people in most places. Most empirical evidence relevant to behavioral science and insights has been collected from experiments that involve weird people alone, and the evidence suggests that many such insights may not be universal. At best, behavioral scientists and social scientists in general, they should expect the efficacy of nudging, it'll vary across cultural contexts. I'm going to struggle with this surname, but as Robin Schimmelpfennig and Michael Muthakrishna recently argued, behavioral priming is often unreliable, and behavior in economic games, such as the dictator game, it varies from 47% offer in the USA to a 26% offer among the Hadza. And so you have this kind of cross-cultural variation. Similarly, in another recent study, they found that extended dishonesty among bankers, it may not generalize to other societies. Fairness in public good games, cross-cultural research, it reveals that fairness preferences vary considerably. And disadvantageous inequity, fairness, which I mean as disadvantageous inequity, whereby you receive less than others, seems reliably developing, but advantageous inequity is not universal. What this cross-cultural empirical evidence reveals is that although behavioral science supports an evidence-based approach to developing and deploying policy interventions for modifying human behavior, such interventions, they're moderated by contextual factors, just as we would expect, including culture, that thwart any attempt to overgeneralize our past successes. So to be clear, my claim is not that cross-cultural difference has been completely ignored in the nudge literature, only that attention to these differences remain the exception and not the rule. A growing number of scholars and scientists, they've acknowledged that contextual heterogeneities, including cultural differences, are essential to reaching conclusions about the efficacy of certain kinds of nudges. For example, the philosopher Luc Bovens, he argues that biases may interact with culturally variable features, and hence will meet with different cultural implementations in order to be successful. And moreover, that different cultures are subject to perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral biases to different degrees. Yet, although such observations have been made, the weird problem, it persists for nudging, especially with respect to the efficacy of these kinds of interventions. David Kasdan, he recently argued that there are few studies that examine the generalized validity across distinct cultural contexts. And similarly, in their recent call for behavioral public policy to be grounded in cultural evolutionary models, Schimmelpfennig and Muthakrishna, they maintain that much more cross-cultural research is required. Culture has not been completely ignored in the literature on nudging, but a more kind of overt recognition would be something that would be extremely valuable for the literature. The weird problem, it not only raises important questions about the efficacy of nudging in cross-cultural contexts, but I think it also raises distinctive questions about the ethical permissibility of nudging, especially if the ethics of nudging literature is going to be relevant in the context of behavioral public policy. So most philosophers of economics and political philosophers who argue for or against the ethical permissibility of nudging, they tend to presuppose the truth of a particular moral or ethical theory, like utilitarianism or some kind of deontological theory. And they reach a verdict on the basis of what they presuppose is that true theory. And then they assume that it applies universally, including within the context of behavioral public policy. In general, these verdicts, they're reached by supporting, by hypothesis, a particular moral theory that's claimed to be true, independent of whether nudgees themselves approve or disapprove of that intervention. So even if we bracket the problem of theoretical uncertainty regarding the nature of morality or ethics for a moment, it remains an open question whether those being nudged, nudgees, whether their approval or disapproval, whether and how that matters to the decision of whether or not it's ethical to nudge people. So there's a question about which ethical theory is true, which is like the puzzle that philosophers are trying to solve. But then there's like this extra question of like, well, do the people on the ground, are they okay? Do they consent to being nudged in certain forms and certain variations? And it seems like that's an important fact when trying to come up with a conclusion about the ethical permissibility of nudging in a particular context. Just about done here. So to provide just a snapshot, relevant evidence suggests that approval and disapproval for being nudged, it does, as you would expect, it varies across culture. And their recent cross-cultural study, Hagman and his co-authors, they conclude that individuals with a more individualistic worldview, so weird people, were less likely to perceive nudges as acceptable, while individuals more prone to analytical thinking were less likely to perceive nudges as intrusive to freedom of choice. So, and something else they said is that to conclude, our findings suggest that the notion of one nudge fits all is not tenable. And what they're really concerned there is understanding, the cultural differences with respect to the acceptability or unacceptability of nudging. And then Castan, he explored the case of the Koreans specifically. And what Castan argued was that while Koreans generally approve of informational nudges, so the provision of information is sometimes construed as a nudge among scholars in the nudge literature. While Koreans generally approve of informational nudges that help them make better decisions about health, welfare, and social issues, they have a distinct approval profile for nudge policies. This is quite reasonable given that different countries exhibit different behavioral biases that come from their unique history, values, and traditions. The statistically significant and negative t-values for the vast majority of nudge, this is the Koreans, proposals in the survey may have to be taken to conclude that Koreans do not like nudges as much as other countries. So again, this is just a point about the cultural variation about the acceptability or unacceptability of nudging. So what are we to make about when it comes to the arguments for and against the ethical permissibility of nudging? My modest claim here in this section is that when reaching conclusions about the ethics of nudging, scholars should be aware of these cultural differences in the approval and disapproval of these behavioral interventions, especially if they wish for their arguments to be relevant to decisions about actual behavioral public policy interventions. Whether the approval or disapproval of behavioral interventions ultimately matters when it comes to making correct ethical judgments about nudging, a question that I will leave unanswered here today. It almost certainly matters when making decisions about actual public policy intervention. Okay. So to summarize, the debate on nudging, it's often revolved around narrow concerns for autonomy, paternalism, and welfare, important issues, no doubt, but ones that have dominated at the expense of broader, more urgent questions. In this talk, I've argued that the ethics and efficacy of nudging, they're interdependent, culturally contingent, and we're in need of recalibration in order to focus on pressing collective action problems like climate change. First, the disproportionate attention on traditional welfare nudging, it should give way to the ethics and efficacy of social nudging. Such interventions, they're often less susceptible to classic objections like paternalism, and they deserve a real central place in research, particularly as humanity faces crises that demand cooperative solutions. Second, the separation between ethics and efficacy of nudging as a universal thesis, it's untenable. I think it rests on a mistake. Inductive risk, the chance of making incorrect conclusions about nudging's efficacy, it necessarily involves ethical judgments as well. And so this blurs the boundary between the normative and the empirical. This interdependence, I think it calls for interdisciplinary collaboration, integrating philosophical insight on the one hand with behavioral science to navigate these public policy issues. And finally, the persistence of the weird problem, it underscores the cultural specificity of many behavioral insights. As behavioral interventions such as nudging expand globally, assumptions that are based on Western norms and conventions, they need to be really interrogated. Understanding cultural variation and attitudes towards nudging is critical not only for determining efficacy, but also for ensuring the ethical legitimacy of interventions. And in sum, the future of nudging research, it lies in broadening its scope to include social nudging as its central focus, embracing the interplay between ethics and efficacy, and addressing cultural variability with rigor. By reframing these priorities, scholars and policymakers alike, they can develop interventions that are not only effective, but also ethically sound, context sensitive, and responsive to the most urgent social challenges of our times. The focus of this talk has been nudging, but of course, nudging is not meant to be the panacea either. It's simply a tool in the toolkit, but it's one that requires humility, interdisciplinary collaboration, and a commitment to real-world impact. Thank you.